Good morning, folks. It is 11:35, which I believe is our start time. Thank you so much for being here. First up is just some housekeeping. This session is being videotaped, and so for those of you wishing not to be videotaped, and those of you who are not giving consent to be videotaped, you ought to pick a different session. And the other thing I was supposed to mention is that there is a QR code right over here by the TV, which is how you can leave feedback about this event. You will also be emailed following this conference with a link to submit feedback that way. But with that behind us, thank you again for being here. My name is Dave Fryxell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Dennis Conservation Land Trust. I'm eager to share with you a project we've been chipping away at since the spring of 2023 called the Community Biodiversity Initiative. What we do is something you may already be aware of, in which many but not enough organizations are already engaged. First, certifying vernal pools, and second, reporting state-listed species to mass wildlife. If I were to summarize this talk and our initiative, it would be that local organizations and their volunteers should be central to biodiversity monitoring and protection to reach your organization's conservation goals and the Commonwealth's biodiversity conservation goals. I am very grateful today to be joined by one such volunteer, in fact, a volunteer leader of other volunteers, Nellie Wilson. So Nellie leads Hilltown Land Trust's vernal pool conservation program called the Vernal Pool Plunge. You'll be hearing from her in the middle of this talk with practical tips about leading a volunteer vernal pool certification program. To start, just a bit about my organization. What is the Dennis Conservation Land Trust? We are a private, local, nonprofit conservation organization focused on land conservation, operating primarily in Dennis on Cape Cod. Our founding documents include a broad set of purposes, similar to many other land trusts, and it is only in recent years that we've built the capacity to address them all. In terms of our structure, we have 17 volunteer trustees, 17 volunteer advisors, over 50 additional volunteers, plus 1 to 2 service members, and just 2.5 full-time staff. This, I believe, is a typical structure for a small local land trust, in that the vast majority of our work is being done by incredibly talented and trustworthy volunteers like Nellie here. And here's an outline for our talk today. First, I wanted to share some background on biodiversity. What is it and what's threatening it? Second, I'd like to share the immense opportunity we have in Massachusetts to involve local entities and non-expert citizen scientists, not only in biodiversity reporting, but in legitimate biodiversity and habitat protection. Third, I'll discuss state-listed species and their reporting to mass wildlife. Fourth, Nellie and I will discuss vernal pools and their certification, including plenty of timely practical tips for getting involved, as the vernal pool season is here. Fifth, I'll introduce our initiative before we open the floor to questions and hopefully some good discussion. As land trusts, we have a tendency to overly emphasize or even focus on the acreage we protect. How much land overall, or how big is the parcel? But when pressed even a little bit, I think we all agree. What matters is what that acreage is and what it provides for us, what its values are. Why do we protect land? Precisely because it has conservation values. Across the land trust community, we protect land for a great variety of reasons. Typically, we evaluate many of these conservation values shown on the screen as we decide which parcels of land to prioritize for protection. The state's land conservation grant programs do the same. And typically, indicators of many of these conservation values are freely available for public viewing on the state's GIS tool called Mass Mapper. This tool allows us, with our organization's ranking criteria established, to easily rank or prioritize with a desktop analysis every parcel in a town or across the state. As an example, the 2 best indicators of biodiversity conservation value available in Mass Mapper are the Natural Heritage Program's Certified Vernal Pools data layer and its Priority Habitats of Rare Species data layer. But a great variety of other data layers exist, addressing most of these conservation values. And as land trusts, we use various techniques to protect land. We acquire and hold title to land, or we add protective overlays to land, such as permanent conservation restrictions that we hold on otherwise unprotected land, or those held by a third-party conservation entity on our own properties. While both of these tools represent the core of our work and the most permanent and robust protections for land, there are other tools as well. And there are other tools in particular that are much simpler, much cheaper, and frankly, much more fun. As I mentioned, available for viewing on Mass Mapper are two data layers relating to the conservation value of biodiversity. They are the Priority Habitats of Rare Species data layer and the Certified Vernal Pools data layer. Both of these are regulatory in nature. Once mapped, these areas are regulated by conservation commissions, Mass Wildlife's Natural Heritage Program, and other entities. This means that if disturbance is proposed in or near these areas, for example, for development, there's an additional permitting requirements, professional review, habitat and species monitoring requirements, and other factors that protect land under regulation, under law. So in essence, the creation of priority habitat areas and certified vernal pools protects land. It should be another tool in our collective toolbox because we ourselves can help determine where these regulated areas are located, as I'll show you today. Today, my goal is to introduce you to these two data layers, these underutilized tools, or if you're already aware of them, convince you to get involved in improving them as a core part of your organization's annual work. So let's back up a bit. What is biodiversity? It is simply the variety of life on Earth. And biodiversity is a term that can be applied at several levels of biological and ecological organization. Levels like genes and genetic diversity, organismal traits and trait diversity, species diversity, which is probably the most commonly thought about level when we hear the term biodiversity. Then there's variation among ecological communities, such as the state's capital N, capital C natural communities designation, so variation in ecological communities, and then ecosystem diversity, which incorporates some aspect of the abiotic or non-living setting in which communities are situated. But for today, our focus will be on species diversity. What are the threats to biodiversity or species diversity? There's no surprise that we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, and there is no shortage of causes threatening biodiversity conservation. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services classifies 5 main threat categories. First is land use and sea change, so this is things like habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. Second, direct exploitation, things like harvest for consumption, but also the wildlife trade. Third is climate change, so warming temperatures on average, increasing frequency of storms, and changes to precipitation patterns. Fourth being pollution, things like nutrients, pesticides, plastics, and light. And fifth is invasive species, including things like emerging or new infectious diseases. You may be tempted to ask what's the most problematic threat, but some smart folks argue, and I agree, that ranking them is not the most useful exercise, especially at large spatial scales. Really, biodiversity threats are best assessed and compared at relatively local scales, in local settings. For example, in Massachusetts, towns have home rule with varying environmental regulations, differing development pressures, different industries, different cultures, and different population sizes. So it is really the local setting that determines threats to local biodiversity, and in no small part, appropriate biodiversity conservation actions. All of that said, from Mass Wildlife's perspective, habitat loss and degradation would be the most important in this state, and I think many of you would agree. That is certainly the case to my mind on Cape Cod. What then is biodiversity conservation? That is the practice of assessing, protecting, monitoring, managing, and restoring the variety of life on Earth. And I put these practices in a particular order to make a point. First, documenting or assessing biodiversity. This is the first and most important step. We have to have the basic information to make decisions. Second, protecting biodiversity. Once you've documented the exceptional or unique biodiversity in a location, you have the information needed to prioritize its protection, for example, through a land acquisition. Third, monitoring, right? Humans are everywhere and having impacts everywhere. Climate is changing, species are moving, species are invading. And so it's important to monitor biodiversity over time with regularity. And then fourth and fifth, I reserve for management interventions, right? Nature is complex, and too often we are arrogant to think we understand the outcome of a management intervention. But until we've done the first steps, documenting, protecting, monitoring, we should be cautious about intervening in nature. And as I hope our simple data analyses will show you, we have a lot of work left to do simply documenting what's out there in terms of biodiversity. What are the main threats here, not to biodiversity itself, but to biodiversity conservation as a practice? I think this here is a reasonable list. First, insufficient knowledge and data. Second, chronic underfunding. And third, lack of political will. These are, of course, related. Without funding, data collection can be challenging. Without political will, where will that funding come from? Without knowledge and data, how could you convince folks to gain political will? I'll go through each of these in turn. Number one, this one's top of my mind. Recently, there have been some high-profile papers confirming what seems obvious. First, too often management interventions are taken without sufficient knowledge, leading to unintended consequences. And second, when results and data are not shared collaboratively with others, we can't learn together for better management outcomes. We need to share data and share what we've learned. Number two, the fundamental problem with funding is that valuing biodiversity in dollars has proven difficult, even for the globe's smartest economists. No silver bullet has emerged. Part of that, at least for me, is that biodiversity has inherent value, has a right to exist, and it provides intangible but enormous benefits to folks like me. To set aside the problem of securing more funding for a moment, another approach would be to reduce costs. And there's a lot of promise in using new technologies like eDNA, sampling by drone, AI tools, you name it. The promise of these technologies is that they're cheaper than hiring people, at least as paid staff. But the problem with thinking that technology will save biodiversity are multiple. The use of technologies instead of people in biodiversity conservation actually reduces involvement by the key people we need involved to protect biodiversity, right? So nothing beats a good old-fashioned boots on the ground field survey. And these humans that are involved must be encouraged to be directly involved in biodiversity conservation, particularly if we want the political will to protect it. So that brings us to our last threat category, lack of political will. And this is compounded by the fact of pluralism, that different perspectives and values exist within human communities and across communities and cultures. This is just a fact of humanity. And while good work is being done to massage cultures into protecting biodiversity, for example, rather than unsustainably harvesting it, the fact is local communities best understand their political setting, local communities best understand the local landscape, the local biodiversity, and the local culture, and therefore, biodiversity conservation and priority setting is and should be primarily local. So my claim, and note this is my claim personally, is that engaging local conservation entities and their volunteers is the key path forward for improved biodiversity protection in Massachusetts. So moving on to this tremendous opportunity we have as citizen scientists and leaders of local organizations to protect biodiversity. Massachusetts has been a leader in conservation across the globe. Not only were we the first conservation land trust founded here, but our Constitution and legislation do a relatively great job at protecting nature. We have zoning laws to protect overdevelopment. We have funding mechanisms to protect open space. We have mechanisms to resist the undoing of land preservation, Article 97. And we have some of the strictest wetlands and endangered species protections at the state level compared with any other state. And importantly, our Commonwealth has home rule, giving local communities a large role in creating their own more stringent environmental regulations. And now, Massachusetts aims to become a biodiversity conservation leader. Governor Maura Healey in September 2023 promulgated Executive Order number 618 to support, complement, and advance Massachusetts biodiversity conservation efforts. More recently, the state announced its nation-leading biodiversity conservation goals. Number one, protect things like land, habitat, and wildlife corridors, but also people from things like, and nature from things like pesticides, pollution, and plastics. Two, restore. Restore the most important habitats with some emphasis on culverts. Culverts, of course, are prominent in the state's biodiversity conservation goals, and that's a management intervention that is relatively simple and has well-known positive impacts for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Number three, sustain funding for biodiversity conservation itself, but also opportunities for wild food harvest, agriculture, and the blue economy, and pairing that with biodiversity conservation. Fourth is connect, right? We need inclusion and workforce development. We need more people involved to protect biodiversity. And with the Department of Fish and Game's new grant program, we may soon have some funding as well. So with this new funding and this new political will, let's engage more people and generate new knowledge and data, protecting more and better land. That's the premise of our Community Biodiversity Initiative. And we have such a special opportunity here in Massachusetts that doesn't exist in less privileged places around the globe. We in Massachusetts have a robust network of local conservation entities who know their towns, can raise local funds, have trusted volunteer labor, and can create political will for biodiversity conservation. As examples, right, the Mass Land Trust Coalition has well over 100 member land trusts. 80 or so are locally based. Then there are conservation commissions. Every town has one. Many have staff departments, well over 100, right? So there are lots of folks interested in conservation at the local level who know their communities very well. And here is the immense opportunity we all have in Massachusetts, the reporting of species to mass wildlife, to the Heritage Program. And what's so special about reporting species to mass wildlife is that is one of the most direct ways for community members to contribute through biodiversity reporting to enforceable biodiversity protection. You know, folks use iNaturalist for bioblitzes, etc., and that's good and useful. It really is. But unless species are properly identified and reported through these channels to mass wildlife, there's no guarantee your observations will have any conservation impact or scientific value. But if you report to mass wildlife, you can literally directly contribute to the protection of a population of a species that you just found. And there are two species categories that can enjoy these protections. First, are vernal pool species. Under the Wetlands Protection Act here in the state, you can focus on identifying just a few species, go out to a freshwater wetland, find some, report that evidence through Mass Wildlife System called Heritage Hub, and that can lead to the regulatory protection of vernal pool habitat, something called vernal pool certification. Second, under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act, people can learn to identify state-listed species and if discovered, report them through the same channels where that observation and the habitat in which the species is found becomes eligible for priority habitat designation. Again, regulatory data layer. And these two biodiversity reporting mechanisms are the focus of our initiative. So I'll start today with state-listed species, which is a bit more complicated than vernal pool certification. There are over 450 such species, some of which cannot be identified by non-experts, and some cannot be properly identified without permits, right? If you need to take a part of a plant, say, to look at it under the microscope, you need a permit for that. So let's set those aside, those species aside. Because the fact is more than 50% of the state-listed species are readily ID'd by non-experts. So this is just an overview of the reporting process, right? You might train staff or volunteers to identify state-listed species. You go out in the field, you find an individual, or ideally quantify a count of population. You take some high-quality photo, video evidence, field notes as well, submit them to Mass Wildlife. Their reviewers would then verify that you've properly identified the species, and then add that observation to something called the Rare Species Viewer database. And then next time, Mass Wildlife, the Heritage Program, periodically updates these priority habitat layers. They may well incorporate the population you found into these updated regulatory maps. Importantly, while vernal pool certification, which we'll get to later, does not have an expiration date, it's one and done, observations of state-listed species are considered historic after 25 years, meaning that those observations are no longer eligible to contribute to priority habitats. So these species once found must be monitored and re-reported to Mass Wildlife over time. And importantly, Mass Wildlife itself does not have adequate staff to monitor these places across the state, nor all populations of state-listed species and habitats where they may be found. They have just a few, I think 4, I was told, employees reviewing submissions through Heritage Hub, and they only have a handful of expert biologists responsible for protecting our state's biodiversity. So the creation and maintenance of protected priority habitats really depends on voluntary monitoring and reporting. So let's take a dive into some publicly available data. The first question we wanted to ask is, how well are we doing reporting state-listed species observations to Mass Wildlife? Here we use the freely available data set from Mass Wildlife called the Rare Species Viewer. This is accessible to anyone online. It includes the list of observed state-listed species in each town. The precise location of the species within a town is rightly hidden for concerns about poaching, overvisitation, and so forth, right? There is concern in this work about spreading the word about the location of these very sensitive species. But just to know, if you're a landowner above which there is priority habitat, you can actually send a request into the Heritage Program to ask which state-listed species underlie that priority habitat. So landowners can know which species are found on their properties. Otherwise, those data are obscured. So if no one is actively monitoring them on your properties, you should consider figuring out what those species are and getting involved with that monitoring. But importantly, this data set, the Rare Species Viewer data set, includes only sparse information, which is only the town's most recent observation year of a species. So this is obviously a screenshot from the tool itself. Here I've selected my town, Dennis, and what you just see when you click on a town is the full list of species that have ever been observed in that town. And there are only a few columns of information, one being the most recent observation year, which will become useful for our analyses. So we use this data set as the best one available to us to understand how many species are being reported, where and when. The first map, the first map we made was simply the count or richness of the number of currently listed species that have ever been reported to Mass Wildlife across all time. Some of these observations do date back to the late 1700s. The scale here, light blue is fewer species and dark blue is more species, and the scale runs from 0 to near 100 species in a given town. What we see is variation across the state. Places like Sheffield, Nantucket, and Plymouth have among the highest species reported ever. However, the possible reasons behind this pattern are unclear, as the data include long historic observations. These species might not still be there today. Does not account for natural variation in habitat availability and species ranges, right? And furthermore, all of this depends on the level to which species were reported by people in these places. So maybe not the most useful map to show. But another question we asked is, of all the species reports in the entire database through all time, what proportion of reports are active, were made in the last 25 years? So these are the proportion of species ever observed that are currently eligible for priority habitat designation. And what underlies the patterns here are also somewhat unclear, again being biased by levels of species reporting in each town. But what we do see is lots of green and a concentration of red. So I'm going to guess, we haven't run this correlation yet, but this is very tightly correlated with development that's happened in the last 100 or 200 years. But to get at the core of our question more directly, we want to know how well species that are actually present are being reported to Mass Wildlife. So here, we took the species reported in just the last 25 years, again, what Heritage considers to be active observations, and asked how many of them have been reported compared with those species expected to be present based on species ranges, species natural distributions. And here we got those distributions from actually an iNaturalist tool that recently came out called GeoModel Predictions. It's not for all 453 species. We could only get this for 348 species, so that's what's represented on this map. What we found across the state is that on average, only 5% of the species expected to be found in a town have actually been reported to mass wildlife in the last 25 years. If we look at comparing some towns, there are 10 towns with 0% of those species reported. And then the highest ranking towns would be Plymouth at 21%, Nantucket at 25%, and Sheffield at 31%. My understanding is that these places have long had active and quantitative monitoring specifically of rare species. Sheffield, I hear the Trustees has an amazing reservation out there. And of course, Nantucket is like 70% permanently protected, right? Nantucket Conservation Foundation, among others, do a great bit of this work. But in conclusion from this map, this suggests that there are lots of new populations to be discovered and reported to mass wildlife, and that towns vary significantly. The last question we asked using these data is how well are we keeping up with reporting? Right? Continued reporting is essential because observations become ineligible for priority habitat after some time. But also because these species are rare, and someone should be checking on them, monitoring them, right? You find an endangered species, you don't just report it once and then forget it. Someone should be responsible for tracking that species, monitoring that species or that population over time. And so this is what we came up with, what we think is the best indicator given our limited data set. And that's to simply map this metric, the number of species reported in the last 5 years over the last 25 years. Right? And so if everything was green here, it means someone annually, say, or within 5 years at least, was re-reporting their previous observations, staying on top of things. But what we found is that on average across the state, so this is the average of all towns across the state, only 26% of observed species were reported again within the past 5 years. This suggests that more monitoring and reporting is needed across the board. We do need more people involved in this work. Now, getting started with state-listed species reporting can be overwhelming, right? There are over 450 species, so where would one start? There are the obvious constraints, such as looking for rare species that you'd actually expect to find in your town based on species distribution. Then there's the fact that not all species are readily identified by non-experts. Third are the legal and ethical considerations. We don't want to harm intentionally or otherwise any state-listed species. So if seed collection, as I mentioned before, is required to identify a species, for example, you must be sure to have an approved permit with Mass Fish and Wildlife, with the Heritage Program. But then there are some other more subjective choices. These can be based on particular taxonomic groups of interest, habitat types, really your personal or organizational interests. In terms of low-hanging fruit, there are a few suggestions to get started. First, if trusted community members send you an observation of a state-listed species, you can go ahead and upload it through Heritage Hub. There are long-standing programs like the Harwich Conservation Trust's Box Turtle program, where they even put an ad in the paper every year to say, send us your box turtle observations. Then Harwich Conservation Trust uploads those observations to Heritage Hub. To start, I recommend focusing on just a few species, learning what they look like, what habitats they frequent, and so forth. But if you're not looking for new populations, you could also carefully visit existing priority habitats. In particular, if you own the land as a land conservation organization, be sure to reach out to the Heritage Program so that you know which species you should be looking for and how best to do so safely. If you don't own the land, you would certainly need landowner permission, and again, you should probably contact the Heritage Program to tell them what you're up to. They should provide assistance. The other point here is that you need to collect good evidence, right? And obviously that's not super clear advice, but good evidence tends to be standardized, right? You have a written protocol. You, make things as quantitative as you can, right? A single species observation is unlikely to be adequate to become priority habitat. The Heritage Program wants to protect a robust population. So if you find a ton of these state-listed species in one area, there's high likelihood that that may become a priority habitat area. And the hope would be, once you get started, that with time you work more and more towards standardized and quantitative data collection and submission to Mass Wildlife. So this is just a bit about what we're doing at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust and with our organizational partners as part of this initiative. And one of these things is the creation of a full-color guide to the rare species of Cape Cod. This was work started by one of our AmeriCorps members, who is probably in the audience, Jen Clifford. Hi, Jen. Who just did outstanding work getting this whole initiative off the ground. So she came up with a template, started drafting a few species based in large part on the state's fact sheets for each species, which are on Mass Wildlife's website, but adding in critical information. But importantly, this is shared with all of our organizational partners, and they've begun adding their own species, their own pages to this as well. So it's a living document, it's inherently peer-reviewed, we'll constantly be updating it, and it's simply made in Canva. Just to highlight some of the key features here, it's exactly what you want to know if you were engaged in this work. So for the heartleaf twayblade, right, you have the scientific name, you have the taxonomic group, the status, it's endangered, recent observations across Cape Cod, which is our kind of service area. So it's been found in Barnstable, Yarmouth, and Harwich, and most recently observed across those towns a few years back. It really dives into key distinguishing characteristics, the habitat in which it is found, and has full color photos of similar species you may confuse the ID with. The last bit is the optimal time for ID. Many of these species need to be ID'd at a certain time of year. So just to recap the state-listed species section here, there are over 450 protected species under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. Specific populations are protected once they're reported as this priority habitat, this regulated area. But the creation and maintenance of priority habitat depends on voluntary observations uploaded through Heritage Hub. And priority habitats expire after 25 years if that species is not again reported to Mass Wildlife. Most of these species can actually be identified by non-experts. I'm not trying to say you'll get up to speed in a day, but with a bit of study, you will get up to speed, and you can train others to get up to speed on how to distinguish these species. And finally, there's so much left to do, and there are two different kind of paths forward in terms of taking action. One would be to learn to identify species, and while you're out and about, discover new populations, may even rediscover formerly lost populations. And the other thing to potentially do is to keep an eye on those priority habitats in your town and get to learn about them, contact the Heritage Program about potentially monitoring whichever species, helping to monitor whatever species may underlie those priority habitats. So just to break things up a bit, we're going to have three opportunities for questions, and we thought that this would be a good one. So at this stage, with respect to state-listed species, I'm happy to take any questions, or we can save them to the end. Any questions for now? Kelly?
Hi, I just wonder if you're able to give any more detail on like how you would identify species on land that privately owned.
Right. So first thing would be to get landowner permission to access the land, right? And then, right, you'd probably be asking for permission because you knew there were certain habitat types, say, on the land. And then you may study which of the state-listed species typically uses that habitat, bring along a field guide, and look for them. Did you have a...
Well, I guess if you've done this, like have you had a more welcome from private landowners? Because I know it can create issues on developability.
Right. So I will say that at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust, we have not considered this really as a matter of practice as we're assessing land protection opportunities, but it certainly could be used with landowner permission in that way. So no real direct experience, although folks like the Native Plant Trust have long-standing monitoring programs, volunteer-involved monitoring programs for state-listed species, and they have great template letters that they send, and they have great success with landowners. Lots of people out there are really eager to know and to learn what's on their land. So there's not necessarily pushback. All the way in the back.
Yeah, I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but why doesn't Mass Wildlife use eBird or iNaturalist? It seems like a wasted opportunity.
So I'm told that the Mass Wildlife biologists are regularly scanning those tools, right? So they are keeping track of what other people believe that they have seen. And then they may use that to do targeted field trips to confirm observations. But right, iNaturalist is imperfect in a variety of ways. And so the state has its own regulation and policies about what evidence can be accepted for priority habitat. And that's about the extent of my knowledge.
Thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I was just, as a person that resides on Nantucket, and I would say just a caution with the data of revisiting populations, especially for plants. You know, as you mentioned, Native Plant Trust really coordinates with the state on assigning revisitation of certain populations over time, and they use a different system to document. And so that's in coordination with the state. So a lot of, especially, and if anyone's here from the state can correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of populations are regulated specifically after so many years they're assigned to be revisited. So, and sometimes it's, you know, whatever, 5 to 10 years or 3 years. So just caution with using that data, but I think a lot of populations are known, and once it's so important to get that initial data sent to the state as you're suggesting.
Right, great. So the comment was just, I guess, a word of caution, basically, again, emphasizing the need to be in contact with the Heritage Program about how best, if you have priority habitat in your town, which, for example, in our town of Dennis, right, we have made observations that have led to the creation of priority habitats. No one else is going to revisit and monitor those populations, right? The Heritage Program themselves will tell you that straight up. They don't have the capacity. We'd all love for them to have the capacity to do that. And hopefully, as part of this initiative, we'll build more political will to raise their budget and hire more people to better manage all of this. Maybe one more question for now.
Yeah, I'm curious how you tease apart some of these lack of observations or reporting versus actual population declines, whether you incorporate that at all in your survey.
Right, so the data that we're using are very coarse, and they're not quantitative measurements. It's just presence, absence data. So unfortunately, at this stage, what we've done doesn't really relate to loss of populations. So do you have a follow-up for me?
Like, how do you determine whether they're not being reported because no one's going out there looking, or because there's a lot of there?
Right, so we struggle to tease that apart, absolutely. We simply don't have the data to say that for certain. That being said, and this is the same problem with iNaturalist. iNaturalist only gives you true presence. It doesn't give you effort, right? So there are no true absences, and this is just a general issue with analyzing these types of data sets. So if in iNaturalist you could say that you found this species, and this species, but you absolutely did not find these other species, those data sets become enormously more useful. So I think for organizations doing this, you track with data sheets whether or not you found something. That's very important. True absences are critical for all of this work. Thank you for those questions. At this point, we'll move on to vernal pools. So right, vernal pools, similarly to state-listed species, they are, vernal pool species can be protected under the Wetlands Protection Act. There are relatively few species that we need to learn to identify and target. We submit evidence through the same system, Mass Wildlife's Heritage Hub. That evidence leads to certification, which adds regulatory protection, and luckily with certification, observations do not necessarily ever expire. So it's one and done.
Can I just say something? I learned at the MACC conference that the Wetlands Protection Act doesn't list vernal pools separately as its own protection.
Right.
So if they're out of another resource area, they're not protected.
Right, so it's my understanding is that it's a function. What's protected is the function provided by vernal pool habitat, the wildlife value. So yeah, I don't get into the details of how they're protected, but I hope towards the end of this section I'll convince you that regardless of the details, it is well worth getting out there to certify vernal pools. But just to begin, what are vernal pools, right? These are isolated depressions in the landscape that are seasonally inundated, meaning they hold standing water. And these habitats are crucial in their support of certain obligate species. And the word obligate here means these species depend on this type of habitat to complete their life cycle and persist. These species can't go instead breed in a pond that has fishes, say, because these species have no defenses against fishes, among other adaptations. So we're talking primarily about amphibians and macroinvertebrate species here. And vernal pools are extraordinarily vulnerable to things like development, right? If they're not identified on a map, they're not certified, a landowner can simply fill them in many cases, depending on your local regulations, and build a house right on top of it. They're also extremely vulnerable to climate change, right? At least on the Cape, where groundwater dictates the water level in vernal pools, and in years of extended drought, those populations can collapse. And that, coupled with groundwater withdrawals, right, for municipal purposes, can also lead to reductions in the amount of time that vernal pools hold water, so much so that the amphibians can't metamorphose out into the terrestrial environment. And critically, unlike other wetlands, many are not protected under the Wetlands Protection Act unless they are certified. And here, just a quick shout out to a great organization called the Vernal Pool Association. They have a very simple website with really to the point, useful information on vernal pool ecology and protection, and some of the details on specifically how certification provides them protection under regulation. So what does a certification process look like? In its simplest form, and it can be very simple, one would go to a small freshwater wetland in spring for the next month and a half or so, let's say. Look for adults or egg masses of species considered to be obligate by mass wildlife, such as these three: wood frog, spotted salamander, and fairy shrimp, which, by the way, have ubiquitous distribution all across the state. You'd look for either adults or egg masses and find and document them. So in this case, you would need, under mass wildlife regs, you need 5 egg masses, any combination of wood frog and spotted salamander in a pool, or any number of adult fairy shrimp, right? You'd collect that evidence along with a little bit more evidence and submit that to Heritage Hub. Then the evidence is reviewed by the state's biologists, and if adequate, the pool becomes officially certified and is mapped here on the right as a little blue dot, where it will now be visible to regulators and land use planners. The state does provide much more detailed guidance on the certification process and what the evidence required is. So the best place to go is that hyperlink down there, mass.gov. It's called the Vernal Pool Certification or Guidelines for the Certification of Vernal Pool Habitat. So I would study up on that. We're interested in taking a dive in the data, asking questions like, how are we doing certifying pools? It's such an incredible tool. Citizen scientists can protect land by doing this work. We should be doing well. How are we doing? And for this, we used 2 different data sets, again, publicly available on Mass Mapper. The first is the potential vernal pools data layer, which identifies landscape depressions that may function as vernal pools based on aerial imagery. So this was done in 2001. From that initial study, it showed that 80+% of those identified potential vernal pools were actually certifiable in the field. Importantly, this potential vernal pools data layer is not regulatory. It's basically ignored by most regulators. So despite the fact that you can show them on a map, they're not important unless they're certified. It's also important to note that this is a static data layer. It's not being updated. This came from a single study. Those PVPs, potential vernal pools, will always be there. And furthermore, that layer was developed using older technology at this point. So it's likely that that layer misses a lot of certifiable pools in nature. And then the second data layer was the state's certified vernal pool data layer. which contains not only the location, but the certification dates of certified vernal pools. So because it contains certification dates, we can simply map the accumulation, or graph rather, the accumulation of certified vernal pools through time. What we see from when certification became a thing in the late 80s is a drastic increase in the rate of accumulation of certified vernal pools, up into a maximum of about around the year 2009 of 377.5 pools per year when averaged. That year in particular, there were 675 pools that were submitted or certified by the state. And then thereafter, the function saturating to near zero. So, right, there seemed to have been a lot of interest and community engagement and public outreach around vernal pools right around the mid-2000s, but we seem to have lost our momentum. So come on, let's reinvigorate this interest in certification, so long as there are pools left to certify. So that's the question, are there pools out there left to certify? Why was there a decline in certification rates? Just on the face of it, counting up all the potential vernal pools, comparing it to the number of certified vernal pools, it would appear there are lots and lots of potentially certified vernal pools out there. Then there's the question of the potential vernal pools data layer and whether most of those pools in that layer or some portion have been certified. So we asked, were most of today's certified pools identified in that layer, or are people just going out finding wetlands that may not be mapped to potential vernal pools and certifying that way? So what we did is we put a 20-meter buffer around each certified vernal pool and asked, is there a potential vernal pool in there? What we found statewide is that 26% of the states, just 26% of the states' certified vernal pools were actually identified in the potential vernal pools data layer. 74% then were certified but not listed as potential. From this, you can do a bit of math. If there are 15,000 potential vernal pools left to certify, but only 74% of those certified vernal pools were not listed as potential vernal pools, back of the envelope calculation, there are over 50,000 certifiable vernal pools left in the state of Massachusetts. So there is an enormous remaining opportunity and need. Next question was about spatial patterns. Where are we doing relatively well with certification? This is a very simple metric, but I think it captures accurately how well we're doing in certification efforts. So the metric is simply to count up the number of certified vernal pools and divide it by the number of potential vernal pools. And this is a simple way to account for town-to-town geographic variation in hydrology, geology, landscape characteristics, etc. So here at the county level, we see large variation across the state. Counties like Berkshire and Essex County have a certification index around 50%, which is not bad, but still there's a lot of work to do. But other counties have even more certification work to do. Plymouth at just 18%, Bristol at 12%, and Dukes at 2%. And just a side note, Dukes County has a different species assemblage, so it's just fundamentally, my understanding, harder to certify pools because some of those key obligate species are absent. More interestingly, right, I'm proposing that biodiversity conservation should happen at the local level, so let's plot this information at the local level. What we see is across the state there are 23 towns with 0% as an index, and then on the far end, the higher end, would be towns like Holbrook at 189%, Quincy at 240%, and Dracut at 264%. So certification has clearly been highly uneven and localized. These contrasts from town to town, even between neighboring towns, illustrate that certification effort, not ecological potential, largely determines these conservation outcomes. And furthermore, nearly every town, perhaps save Holbrook, Quincy, and Dracut, have ample opportunity for remaining certification. The question has come up, if you look at some of those darkest blue towns, towns like Dracut and Quincy, why? What happened there? Who's behind it? What organization is behind it? And while I'm not familiar broadly across the state, I have some familiarity with Cape Cod, so I've gotten some stories. So Harwich ranks really highly. Turns out that was an initiative of the Conservation Commission. In Eastham, a rogue individual citizen scientist made it their personal mission to certify as many pools as possible. And then in Yarmouth, which ranks poorly, not as poorly as Dennis at the moment, their select board actually recently directed their natural resources department to certify pools. So this goes to show that certainly citizen scientists can do this on their own. We recommend organizational oversight, but there are various pathways and groups interested in certification. In terms of starting a program, and just a few slides here before Nellie steps up, right? So at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust, we started a small program, and this advice comes from that and working with our partners who have also started their own programs. My recommendation would be study that vernal pool certification guide that I showed on the screen earlier, and to focus on the simpler method to certify. It's called the obligate species method. Second step would be to have your staff, maybe a few volunteers, attend an in-person certification training. These are offered by groups like MACC, like this organization, Mass Land Conservation Coalition, as well as many others. We provide them as well. Within the first and second season, the staff should probably lead field work, focusing on properties that are already protected. And then maybe a couple seasons later, you trust your volunteers enough that maybe you give them some guidance on pools to prioritize, to visit, but they're doing field work on their own. And that's what's happened for us in Dennis. And then longer term, the goal would be to start seeking landowner permission on private unprotected properties, learning to use more complex methods like the facultative species method to certify pools, or maybe even using new technologies like passive audio recorders, which truly have less of an impact as far as certification goes. You don't need to enter the pool, stir up the sediment, potentially harm inadvertently organisms. And then longer term, my goal would be that these organizations, maybe their towns well certified already, they transition to more monitoring than simply documenting quantitatively using standard methods. And just before I hand it off to Nellie, I wanted to touch on why we certify vernal pools, right? Of course, it triggers some regulatory protection under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. But it actually is even more important. It can be even more important in certain towns which have more restrictive local wetlands bylaws. For example, many towns have adopted bylaws that add a protected buffer zone around vernal pools. And so it also, the importance of certification depends on where you are, but regardless, it's important. For those of us interested, to Kelly's question, in protecting a new parcel of land, say there's a land deal that you're working on, landowners collaborative, they have a couple of potential vernal pools, it will help you to certify that pool before you apply for that state land grant, because that adds conservation value to the property. But there are other reasons as well, and it's truly because vernal pools are invisible to regulators and to planners unless they're certified. And so just a quick example from Dennis, right? Cape Cod right now is being sewered because of our nitrogen pollution problem from septic systems. And so the town of Dennis was hired a consultant to determine the best place to put the treated wastewater back into our aquifer. And one of 20 metrics they used in that decision was the proximity to the nearest certified vernal pool. So right, this is a conservation value that's being used in all sorts of analyses for land use planning. At the time, Dennis had one certified vernal pool, so it wasn't very useful. I also recently learned that according to the state's best management practices for mosquito control, chemical pesticides should not be used in certified vernal pools. Another reason, if you're familiar, at least with the Cape Cod Mosquito Control Project, it's a great group, but they're out in all the wetlands spreading mosquito control products all the time, and we're working directly with them now to better exclude certain habitats from being treated. Again, but we can influence policy in the future such that certified vernal pools don't need to be treated at all. So the bottom line here is that certification transforms an otherwise invisible habitat feature into a highly visible and protected biodiversity asset. And with that, I wanted to welcome Nellie here. So Nellie, again, is a volunteer with the Hilltown Land Trust. She's leading their vernal pool certification program. So she's a volunteer leader of other volunteers with some years of experience doing this out in the field. So Nellie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here and getting to talk with all of you folks today. Just a little bit about Hilltown Land Trust. They're an organization here in Western Massachusetts and doing really great work. And one of the new things that we have come up with is actually forming a vernal pool subcommittee of their stewardship committee. So vernal pool program, our specific program was started by Meredith Babcock of Wild and Scenic Westfield River. She is an amazing human being, has such a passion for vernal pools. And in between 2014, 2018, she was out with Wild and Scenic Westfield, and they were working on projects of collecting visual data along stream corridors along the Westfield watershed. And one of the things she kept noticing is, I'm hearing wood frogs, I'm hearing choruses, and started to note vernal pools along in these areas. And one of the things that she was also noticing is that a lot of these vernal pools were outside of the 200-foot riparian zone where they would be protected. So she started in on developing an educational program, and then that program transitioned into 2019 offering a 3-day training that was in collaboration with Hilltown Land Trust. And that training allowed us to be able to get the information that we needed. So I attended that training, and we were able to get the information that we needed with Charlie Eisman, who is a local naturalist. He went through, offered so much information, focus on obligate species identification because it is easiest. And then we got to go out into the fields and actually look at vernal pools. One of the vernal pools that we visited had fairy shrimp in it, and I fell in love. And I just was like, wow, this is so amazing. And that excitement back in 2019 is what has gotten me here to today. So thank you, Meredith. And so then with that training, the way it was organized was that basically people from a bunch of different towns, at the time there were 16 towns in Western Mass that were going to have reps, so town representatives that would be the person going out, looking at vernal pools, collecting the data, being able to submit it to Natural Heritage. And so that was kind of the process. And then we got into the pandemic, and Wild and Scenic Westfield said to Meredith, you've got too many projects on your plate, you need to hand this off. It went to Hilltown Land Trust, and in 2022, Hilltown Land Trust offered a 2-day training, and so got some people involved. And then things kind of tapered off a little bit, and there wasn't. I think Sarah and I have talked about this a little bit, that there wasn't like a clear home for what this project was and how to be able to move it forward. So in 2023. I started bugging Hilltown Land Trust because I'd been out there on my own trying to figure out, like, hey, what's going on? Like, I'm going to just go out and certify vernal pools, collect the data, submit it, and make it happen. But I was wondering, what's going on with this program? And so then we offered just kind of a general educational event and did a little field trip. And then in 2024, 2025, we started reaching out to people who had already taken the program to just kind of see like where are alums at, and is there anything that they're up to, and how can we regenerate interest. And that's also when we started forming the vernal pool subcommittee. So one of the things I wanted to just share with you today, right, is that we've had a program and the program continues to evolve. And so some of the challenges that we've run into is really that the initial structure of having a town representative, it didn't work in our area. And the individuals having being in charge of submitting the data, I think was also a struggle for a number of people. Is that when we did the training in 2019, Heritage Hub didn't even exist. It was an old program and it was so clunky. and so then there was the transition to using Heritage Hub, which is a lot better, but still has some bugs to it that I might mention depending on how much time we have. So it was also, as an organization for Hilltown Land Trust, it was also like there wasn't any way to kind of keep track of what people were doing, was the main point of it. So, the pluses, I would say, is that some people like myself were continuing to work independently, and we wanted to collect data, and we were submitting it. And, I have personally been able to get a number of vernal pools in my town of Chesterfield certified. And so that's been really exciting. And the plus is also we've formed a committee, we've had alumni events, and we're now part of Hilltown Land Trust's larger biomonitoring project. And so our programming now really has more of a place in what's happening. We also did a video last year. I happen to be the person that they recorded because I'm just a super geek and I love vernal pools. And then with the vernal pool, we did field trips in 2025, and we've been able to collect data on just 4 new pools just with 2 field trips. So for the future, this year, we are going to be offering a full training again. And I'm really looking forward to that. So the training is going to be a 2-day event. We're having an evening webinar with the video that Charlie Eisman, who's the local naturalist, had recorded for us. And we'll also be presenting information about the decontamination protocol and about how we're going to be doing data submission. And just to be clear, we're not having individuals submit the data anymore. What they're going to do is submit it to Hilltown Land Trust. It's going to go into a Google Drive, basically, and then from there, either a volunteer or an HLT staff member will be the one who's actually entering the data. This way, we can make sure that we're keeping track of, who's out there, who's doing what, how many pools are getting submitted, and just allows for more oversight. We're also going to be doing more educational outreach and networking. Part of being here is kind of a networking opportunity, and the connection that we've made with Dave has been wonderful as an opportunity to start to connect and share resources. And then we also are interested in doing more of connecting with conservation commissions in our area, and again, including this in larger biomonitoring initiatives. So just to kind of go over some things is that supplies, right? We want to be able to provide people with the tools that they need to be able to go out and be able to certify a vernal pool. This is the Vernal Pool Bible. This field guide is super, super valuable, and it's something that I highly recommend offering to all volunteers that are going to go out into the fields. It just helps so much with being able to do species identification. And then we provide nets, we provide containers, having it can be real simple, right? Take out food containers, a clear one and like a white plastic one can be really helpful for getting good photos. I didn't put it on the list, but having a waterproof cell phone case, or even just having like a bag of Ziploc bags that you make sure that people put their cell phones in, because we don't want to have people dropping their phones in a pool. Another thing that I have found super helpful is when you're taking pictures of things that are underwater, you can get a lot of glare. And so just having a black plastic folder, right? You drop it in the pool, so what? Like it can get wet and it's not gonna be a problem. But holding that over the egg masses that you're trying to take a picture of can be really useful for getting a quality image. And it's something that's just really simple and easy, like $1 or less to get a bunch of these folders to just have for people to use. And then there's supplies that we recommend that people bring on their own, right? We want to make sure that they've got appropriate boots and things like that. These days, most everybody has a smartphone, and that in and of itself tends to be good enough technology to be able to get the images and the GPS information that you need. The decontamination protocol is something that we are really trying to get incorporated clearly into our programming. It was something that, back in 2019, we didn't even really talk about it, but ranavirus and other things are becoming more of an issue, and so we really want to make sure that we're protecting the species that are in these pools. So this information that I've shared, the Vernal Pool Association, the link up there, they have a great video as well as a great handout that lists the whole protocol that you can use and how to be able to get things clean and just make sure that you're keeping things safe. Some of the other things that is kind of a newer thing is the state is now really recommending that you use disposable gloves if you are going to be handling egg masses or amphibians. Again, in the past, we were working off of make sure that your hands are clean, that they don't have any lotion or bug spray, things like that. We also still encourage, just if people don't wear a bunch of scented stuff, don't have bug spray on your clothing when you're going out into vernal pools. And one of my favorite things is to think about if you are going to have to step into a vernal pool to be able to get photos and identify things, is to think about walking like a great blue heron, right? So you start with your toe and you just gently walking and really paying attention to where your feet are. And so I just wanted to share some photos of pools that we have been to, and some of them are really big, some of them are really small. Wood frogs and spotted salamanders are definitely the most common species that you find. Going out to look for egg masses is the easiest way to be able to get your species information because they're not going to run away from you. And we have found a few pools up around in the hill towns that do have Jefferson salamander egg masses, which is always exciting to find. And there are those very rare pools that have fairy shrimp in them, which again was just the thing that like made me fall in love with doing this work. Just some examples of like pools that I have been able to certify. I've had some individual landowners, you know, that like I've been able to get in touch with in my community who have had pools on their property that I've been able to certify. There was this little like 20-foot by 20-foot pool that had 160 spotted salamander egg masses in it the year that I certified it, and like visiting it following years, like it still had a whole lot. And other pools is that, you know, I've done some pools, certified them that are just on state land. So like I don't need landowner permission, but having those documented, like Dave was expressing, to be able to know that they're there so that if the state were to ever be like, oh, well, you know, there's a lot of trees there, maybe we want to log some of this, that those areas would be protected and wouldn't be harmed if they're going to be logging. Go back. And then just, you know, the one of the pools that we submitted data on for 2025 was a big pool, and in that one there were 435 spotted salamander egg masses that I counted, 3 Jefferson salamander egg masses that I counted, and wood frog tadpoles galore. So like it's just a real joy to be able to go out there. And I think that's one of the pieces that's like so important for developing a program, is to make sure that your volunteers get that this is like really exciting and really fun. And one of the things that we're really trying to do with our program is to build in that sense of community and, you know, having a listserv so that we can stay in touch with each other and organize field trips beyond the actual training so that we can go out together and work as groups and make things happen. Our program is, you know, it's developing. We don't have anything set in stone, and I think that's a really great place to be in, is to have a responsive program so that like if you've got people that's like, oh my gosh, like I'm super passionate about this, to uplift those volunteers and like really work with them. And Hilltown Land Trust has done that with me, and it's been a delight. So just some further resources for folks, and also, if you guys want to get copies of this, you can be in touch with Hilltown Land Trust, and we can get you the slides. And yeah, just wanted to thank Hilltown Land Trust, Meredith Babcock. Meredith's amazing. Charlie Eisman, and then Calla Jones is the contact person you can reach out to if you want more information about this. And at this point, I'd love to kind of welcome David back up so we can wrap up and just say thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, I'm going to show just a few more slides, and then we can have some questions. So the last bit here, and thank you so much, Nellie, is about our broader community biodiversity initiative. And I just wanted to thank the folks who were involved from the beginning, including Dr. Fernando, and then several AmeriCorps members. Goes to show how valuable AmeriCorps is as a program. But right, the goal of our broader initiative is to motivate involvement in species reporting, certification, and state-listed species, hence the maps I showed you earlier, but also to lower the barrier to entry to new organizations getting involved with this sort of thing. To date, we have around 13 partner organizations, primarily in southeastern Massachusetts. And similar to Nellie at Hilltown, we are using the model where Local environmental organizations recruit community scientists, they do the field works, send it as an initial gatekeeping step through the local environmental organization, who then submits evidence to Mass Wildlife. We are building a community, similarly to Hilltown Land Trust, within its vernal pool program of organizations doing this thing. We're asking for a small commitment of submitting 3 observations to Mass Wildlife each year. We're giving trainings and requiring a commitment to follow best practices, and especially to keep state-listed species observations confidential. I will say 2 more things. One is that we are providing guidance resources so that all our volunteers can have potential vernal pools prioritized into ones that are higher priority for certification, lower priority certification, right there on your cell phone in Google Maps. Some exciting next steps as well. This is what I will end on. At DCLT, at our organization, since we started engaging in this sort of work very recently, we found 2 threatened, 1 endangered, 1 species of special concern, never before reported in our town. So don't let anyone tell you that everyone knows where these populations are. We also found 1 new population of a threatened species, right? So separate populations of the same species in our town that was accepted by the Heritage Program. We have 19 vernal pools certified or in progress. So we, among many other organizations, are doing this, and it works. And what we want is local involvement, but statewide. So Nellie and I will be here, up here, if you'd like to ask us any questions. I apologize for running long and being out of time. The one handout that I have are by county, the vernal pool ranking maps. It's vernal pool season. We're hoping for some inspiration to get involved. So if you're curious where your town stands relative to the town surrounding you, you can come grab one of these. Anything else to add, Nellie, at the end?
No. Just thank you, everyone. And yeah, I hope that we've offered some inspiration for getting vernal pool protection and larger species protection programs going in your land trusts.
Thank you very much.